Good evening. I'm Karen Schubert. I'm the director of Lit Youngstown, and I would like to welcome you to a reading by David Giffels, co-sponsored by WYSU. This reading is the culminating event of the fourth annual Lit Youngstown Fall Literary Festival. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our sponsors who make this event possible: the Natalie and James Andrews Foundation, Ohio Humanities, the Youngstown Foundation, the Ohio Arts Council, the Community Foundation of the Mahoning Valley, the Northeast Ohio Master of Fine Arts, the Youngstown State University English Department, the Center for Judaic and Holocaust Studies at Youngstown State University, Youngstown State University Beagley College of Liberal Arts, Social Sciences, and Education, and our many generous supporters. I would also like to say a special thank you to the Planning Committee, the Lit Youngstown Board of Directors, and our production team, Dainil Rosales and Andrea Cash, Liz Hill, and Cassandra Lawton, and to all who attended and made this year's conference memorable. This evening's host will be Youngstown State English professor Timothy Francisco. Tim is a professor of Old British Lit, purveyor of new media, and director of the Center for Working Class Studies at Youngstown State. He describes himself as an academic, a storyteller, and a civic engagement guy. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Karen. Good evening, everyone. I am Tim Francisco from WYSU-FM and YSU Center for Working Class Studies, and welcome to another amazing Lit Youngstown event, part of the Fall Literary Festival. Tonight, we are listening to and talking with writer and journalist David Giffels. David is the author of 6 books of nonfiction, including Furnishing Eternity, All the Way Home, and The Hard Way on Purpose. The latter, long listed for the Penn Diamonstein Spielvogel Award for the Art of the Essay. A former columnist for the Akron Beacon Journal, David's work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Esquire, and many, many other venues. His latest book, Barnstorming Ohio to Understand America, does exactly that. It charts a journey across the state of Ohio to understand our nation through the lens of this bellwether state. David, thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks. It's been great to be around the festival for the past 2 days.
Awesome. Well, we're going to start by listening. So David, please take it away.
All right, thanks. Well, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Karen, and thanks to everybody who worked so hard to pull off this great festival under difficult conditions, but it's been really great to have been associated with it, and I'm really glad to be able to read something from the new book. I chose a selection. I have good news and bad news. I chose a selection that is actually set in Youngstown. That's the good news. The bad news, it's a story of hard times, but that's what Youngstown does best. So this is from a chapter titled Lordstown. Monty Woolley was standing on the line the day the last Chevy Cruze came down. A union electrician, he had worked a quarter century at the GM Lordstown plant, nearly half his life, following the footsteps of his father, who'd made his career there, straight to retirement. In his navy blue coveralls and dirty white shop floor sneakers, Woolley had stepped out of the plant's paint shop and crowded in with his coworkers, surrounding the half-completed body, all of them wanting to be near their final product. Some of these were close friends he'd known for decades, others passing figures at the time clock. Folks dressed in hoodies and ball caps, coveralls and yellow safety vests, along with the wrist and elbow sleeves and knee braces necessitated by the toll the work had taken on their bodies. He knew that some of these people had new mortgages and babies on the way, aged parents in their care, and dreams that would have to be set aside. You could look in people's eyes, he said. Even up to that point, everybody had hope. Everybody thought something's going to happen good. Something's going to change. And you just look in their eyes and you just see the sadness, the lack of hope. Amid the crowd of coworkers, he could feel the lump rising in his throat, an emotion he did not want to show. He turned and walked away. 2 months later, I sat with him in the dim shadows of his living room in the middle of a cloudy weekday morning when everyone else in this quiet Youngstown neighborhood was off at work. Wooly, with a shaved head and a full white goatee, dressed in denim shorts and a teal t-shirt, rested his stockinged feet on the footrest of a brown recliner, a spot where he'd been spending more time lately than he'd prefer. He and a handful of other UAW workers had been kept on for about 6 weeks following the shutdown, tasked with bringing perpetual motion to a stop. This process represents one of the harshest of the narratives that have echoed across American industrial cities for the past 3 decades. The longtime shop floor worker whose final assignment is shutting down his workplace, sometimes having to dismantle his own machine, sometimes even preparing it for shipping to a plant in another city or another country where someone else will do the same work for less money. Wooly that morning was waiting anxiously for the mail carrier. He'd been expecting his letter, thought it might have arrived yesterday, but it hadn't. That letter, like so many others arriving in homes around the valley and beyond, would reveal his fate. Employees who'd been laid off from Lordstown were receiving mailed offers of positions at other GM plants, a prospect that for many was just as fraught with upheaval as unemployment. Lives would have to be uprooted, children pulled from school, families separated, homes dumped for a loss, all to keep a paycheck that couldn't be duplicated nearby, or to maintain a track record toward retirement that required sticking with GM. The week of the shutdown, my local newspaper and a few other news outlets carried an op-ed column by a soon-to-be jobless 20-year Lordstown veteran named Nanette Centers, who called the relocation offer a false choice. "I can't just pick up and leave," she wrote. "My entire family lives in the Lordstown area. My 84-year-old mother is too frail to move, and she relies on me for her care. I'm also expecting my first grandchild here in June. But if I don't relocate, I may not be able to find another job that pays a living wage." Echoing a resentment I heard repeatedly throughout that season, she called out politicians whose promises had manipulated people's hopes and their votes, only to come up empty. In a region where Union Democrats had made a tidal electoral shift toward Donald Trump, his rallying words reverberated: "Don't move, don't sell your house." I reached out to Centers to ask if we could talk, and for several weeks we tried to schedule a meeting. But throughout that time, she was overwhelmed by the turbulence of losing a job she'd valued specifically for its stability. Few people work in factories primarily for the love of it. They do it for the good pay and benefits, the steadiness that allows them the possibility of a comfortable, meaningful existence beyond work. There's dignity in that transaction, a basic American contract of trust, hard work traded for its reward. In our final text exchange, Centers reflected the turmoil that occurs when that contract fails, giving way to forces beyond one's control. "Hi, David. I've been trying to organize the things necessary for me to move on a moment's notice. Put my 85-year-old mother in assisted living last month and am selling her house. Had my first grandchild yesterday, a beautiful baby girl. I have elderly pets and am waiting till the last minute because when the call comes, they will have to be euthanized. The change would kill them anyway. The whole thing is devastating. I have 5 or 6 years of service before I can retire. I'm considering refusing the offer and retraining, but I'm terrified that I may not be able to get a new job at my age. So anyway, I would be happy to speak with you. Send me a message before you call and I will answer. I tried, but never heard from her again. Meanwhile, Monty Woolley waited for his own letter and the choice he'd have to make. Just a few months before everything was ripped from each individual's control, his birthday had brought him to the union contract's magic number for retirement, in which his age, 59, and years of service, 26, added up to 85. But he had planned to work longer with his retirement target in 2023. This threw a monkey wrench into everything, he said. Woolley wanted to make sure I understood that he considered himself among the fortunate. His sons were grown and out on their own. His wife, Susan, had a good job working as a computer programmer at Joy Cone, the ice cream cone company not far across the Ohio border in Pennsylvania. He'd been careful with his savings. Moving temporarily would represent a significant financial hit, in addition to a separation, probably for the better part of a year, from Susan, who would need to stay here for her job. But he would still be able to finish his GM career on something close to his own terms. Describing himself as one of the lucky ones, however, was not an expression of relief. More than once in our conversation, he followed such statements with references to what he knew was happening in other households across the Mahoning Valley. Many of those people he'd stood with on that final production day were at the mercy of GM, mid-career, living lives that relied on the income that had built them. Some had recently taken on large mortgages. Some were married couples who'd suddenly lost 2 incomes. Most would not have any option other than to move to wherever GM would have them. I don't know how it is where you live, he said, but this area, there's very strong family ties here. People don't like to move away from family. He shook his head. What do you say to someone like that? In a region where job stress is part of the fabric, he knew what layoffs did to people. He'd been laid off himself. Through 26 years inside Lordstown Assembly, he could never feel at ease. For the past 2 generations, anxiety had been creeping into the psyche of the people who'd built America, who'd created its middle class and validated the notion of its dream. As the 20th century ticked down and the 21st began, there was a vague, unshakable sense that something was slipping away. So Woolley knew there would be domestic strife, fistfights, arrests, drinking and drug habits spiraling toward crisis. A week after the GM announcement, a friend from Youngstown told me of a dark story buzzing through his neighborhood, that a laid-off worker there had committed suicide. In a few cases, but too many, Woolley said, we're hearing of people getting divorces already. Families are really paying for this, and unfortunately, kids are paying for it. In a layoff, you're gonna wreck families. You're gonna wreck people, basically, because it didn't need to happen. It was a mean-spirited thing for the company to do. We did everything they wanted us to do, and they still turned around and stabbed us in the back. Near the close of the 20th century, when Bruce Springsteen was of a mind to write about a lost and forgotten America, to reckon the accounts of people who'd been left out of a changing calculation, People who'd once been something like royalty under what he called a beautiful sky of soot and clay, and who were now foundering. He turned to Youngstown. Springsteen's album, The Ghost of Tom Joad, is widely recognized for its grittily authentic chronicle of the poor and disenfranchised. In his autobiography, Born to Run, Springsteen cast the album as a confrontation with the moral question that had dogged him amid the dizzying commercial ascendancy of his career. Where does a rich man belong? The album's fourth song was inspired by a book, Journey to Nowhere, The Saga of the New Underclass, written by Ohio native Dale Marridge and photographed by Michael Williamson, a duo that has collaborated on 4 books, each variously exploring the plain and overlooked people of America. An aged hobo, the citizens of a small Ohio town, and the Southern poor, whose tale they told and whose tale they documented in And Their Children After Them, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. Journey to Nowhere, published in 1985, chronicled the human and social burdens of the industrial downturn in Northeast Ohio, a region just then becoming known as the Rust Belt. The history of steel in the Mahoning Valley is the history of America, writes Marridge, who'd begun his journalism career at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, dead center in the debris field of industrial implosion. You didn't have to go looking for authenticity in Northeast Ohio then. It crunched underfoot. Springsteen had acquired the book upon its release, but never got around to reading it. As Rolling Stone reporter Brian Hyatt tells it in Bruce Springsteen, The Stories Behind the Songs, the songwriter, in the midst of the Tom Joad sessions, picked up Journey to Nowhere in the middle of a sleepless night, fell into its thrall, and finished it by morning. Almost immediately, he wrote Youngstown. With Tom Joad, Springsteen seemed almost desperate for humility and wary of it too. For such a master of artifice and persona, humility could have meant adopting a new Steinbeckian cloak, a costume change from his racing in the streets leather. Instead, he seemed determined to use his privilege to illuminate the character of people whose dignity was at great risk, and to do so before it was too late for him. The line between fetishization and sincere illumination was dangerously thin. And the bullshit detector in places like Youngstown was exquisitely tuned, as happens in places that have been force-fed a diet of the stuff. If Springsteen wanted to offer his voice to the voiceless, he needed to do right by his subjects. They traveled light, Springsteen wrote in his memoir of these people he invoked. They were lean, direct in their expression, yet with most of what they had to say left in the silence between words. Despite the album's old-timey echoes, the Ohio he tapped there in the waning 20th century was as raw as a gunshot wound. Youngstown begins with the early 19th century discovery of iron ore in a creek valley near the titular city, and the subsequent establishment of the Hopewell Furnace, the region's first iron mill. The song tells of the families that endured the heat and filth of the mills as their penance for a life in the middle class, and evokes the role of steelworkers in winning America's wars and creating its millionaires. Once I made you rich enough, Springsteen sings, rich enough to forget my name. In the final lines, the narrator prays for an afterlife in hell, the only appropriate counterpart to the blast furnaces of Ohio. Most important, however, is the chorus, addressed to a darlin' named Jenny, the most bittersweet word in all the rich shop-worn lexicon of the Mahoning Valley. Jenny was the local nickname for the Jeannette blast furnace, which smelted ore into pig iron, dominating the operation inside the Campbell Works of Youngstown Sheet and Tube, a steel mill that employed nearly 30,000 people at its peak, and whose towering, belching, unglamorous profile defined the region's silhouette. The steelworks was an outsized elementary fact of life for all who lived within reach of its stinking shadow. In Sticks and Bones, an essay of his Youngstown youth, Gordon Murray recalls, "The mill was so long that it seemed only to have a middle." The adjective paternal is usually applied to a large corporate industrial employer. But in the Valley, Youngstown Sheet and Tube, YS&T for short, seemed much more maternal, a nurturing presence, an essence, a warm, pulsing thing watching over everyone. Jenny. Murray's essay was published in an anthology of writing and photographs about Youngstown, Car Bombs to Cookie Tables, in which YS&T appears again and again, beginning with the cover image of a mill's interior. The steelmaker, established in 1900, is a touchstone, first for nostalgia, then collapse. On September 19th, 1977, still referred to in the Valley as Black Monday, YS&T announced the closing of the Campbell Works, putting 5,000 people out of work, destroying countless lives, and eliminating a region's very identity and purpose. Here's how Springsteen described the corporate acts. "Them big boys did what Hitler couldn't do." Jenny was the last blast furnace still operating in a community whose entire ecosystem had relied on the steel industry. The valley was decimated. Whatever hope remained was housed at Lordstown Assembly. It's hard to overstate the effect Springsteen's song had in this part of Ohio. When it came out just before Thanksgiving 1995, the Jeannette blast furnace still held its profile alongside the Mahoning River, rusty and dormant, an ugly symbol of an unhealed wound. Most people in the region agreed that the song got it right, both in its somber, bitter lyrics and its haunting, unadorned delivery. Even more welcome was that someone had taken note. Youngstown, Cleveland, Toledo, most of Ohio's cities, as well as Ohio itself, were long accustomed to a different sort of invocation, our place names used as punchlines or as cultural code for a backward, unsophisticated place. A Mark Twain quip whose veracity has been disputed, but whose message is achingly familiar, is well known to Ohioans. When the end of the world comes, I want to be in Cincinnati because it's always 20 years behind the times. Springsteen's song was on local radio a lot that year. He came to Youngstown in the middle of a January snowstorm to play a sold-out solo acoustic concert at the city's Stambaugh Auditorium. The 2,600 seats filled with people whose story was in those lyrics. Los Angeles Times music critic Robert Hilburn was in the audience and described a room that fell silent as Springsteen introduced the song. This is about the men and women who lived in this town and who built this country. It's about the people who gave their sons and daughters to the wars that were fought. and who were later declared expendable. The crowd remained silent, other than an unavoidable, spontaneous yawp upon hearing their city's name emerge from the lips of the fabled singer, hanging on every word until the song's final chord, then erupted into a standing ovation. Springsteen received the key to the city and, buoyed by the warm reception, stayed an extra day to see some of its sights. Youngstown remains a staple in Springsteen's live repertoire. The hushed acoustic ballad translated by the E Street Band into a 6-minute long burner whose final phrase, "the fiery furnaces of hell," gives way to Nils Lofgren's extended searing guitar solo, mourning and defiant. In concert footage, he plays himself into a frenzy, whirling mid-stage, refusing to be ignored. Meanwhile, Journey to Nowhere, the account that inspired the song, is out of print. So thank you. And Tim, I'll ask you to come back into the Zoom room.
I am back in the Zoom room, David.
Welcome back to the Zoom room, Tim.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that reading. I have to say, hearing that, I've read the book, but hearing that, I was struck by this idea of the Springsteen performance, right? And that kind of silence, and then bursting into, the standing ovation, the emotion. And it reminds me of the theme that seems to reverberate throughout your book. And I wondered if you could talk about it. And that is that need, that desire for places like Youngstown to be heard, to be seen and to be heard. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I've lived here all my life, and I understand how much a part of our identity it is that we are most often either ignored or misunderstood. We're most often told our narrative by people who've concocted it from the outside, then asked to tell our own story, and it's frustrating. And the rare occasions that we tell it, we take very seriously. Again, which is why I think Springsteen was accepted here, welcomed here, because he had come to listen and because he had seemed to respect our version of the story and not to make his own. And again, I said, Youngstown has a bullshit detector. They would have known if he was using them the way so many others have used. And as I researched this book, I spent a year traveling the state. I traveled over 4,000 miles, and I listened to over 100 people. And as I was deep into the process, I recognized something consciously that had been kind of working on me subconsciously the whole time, which is this urgent question from people from all different aspects of the story I was trying to tell, which is, who will listen to me? And that's a question that is that they were asking. They wanted me to listen to them, but they wanted to know who else will listen to them. The politicians who are going to come here wanting our electoral votes, the journalists who are going to come here wanting authenticity, because we have authenticity in spades. How we have real people, ordinary people, 11 million of them. It's the question of other Americans wanting to know if Ohio can still tell us something about ourselves, and so on. And it's the question of the politician, who will listen to me. And so it resonated throughout, and I think it's a question more and more, not just of Ohio, not just of Youngstown, but of all of America. Like, we're not being listened to anymore. And in fact, we're putting ourselves into situations, into social media situations where it's not really a place to listen. It's just really a place to have your own beliefs repeated by other people who have the same beliefs. And it's certainly not a place to be challenged in any sort of civil way. And we're reaching, I think, a danger of cynicism, in that we don't really believe that any politician ever listens to us for anything other than their own cynical means. And so it's an urgent question. And it's not only an urgent question, it's a question that needs to be tested, I think, not just politically, but culturally, so that we can maintain our sense of identity and our sense of respect for one another.
Yeah, I think, well, there's so much there in what you just read, but also in what you just said. And the passage that you began, that you read for us tonight, began with doing exactly what you said you aimed to do in the book, and that is to have Ohioan story told by Ohioans. So I wonder if you could reflect back maybe and think about the ways in which Centers and Woolley's stories, as they're included in the book, say something different about Ohioans that maybe counters some of those drive-by narratives that, as you say, we get every 4 years, every 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nuance to their stories that I think is lost on when it moves upward into the global forces of a massive corporation and the global forces of a president and other politicians trying to pressure something to happen, and even the global force of the United Auto Workers, a very big institution.
Yeah.
And then you go into the single individual tale and how this is affecting them. And there's, Monty Woolley was like, close enough to retirement that he probably could have accepted that his career ended a little bit short of what his plan was. And, compared to what happened to other people, nobody, including himself, could have said he really had it that badly. But again, as I read, you work decades in a job that doesn't really fulfill you spiritually, because you're working for something else. You're working for a sense of freedom outside of that job, that it's providing you a sense of self that the income allows you to do, and then you live a life that you want to live. And it provides you a sense that if I do everything right and I get to the end, that I get to finish on my own terms. And so it's taking away his dignity and in some ways his humanity to say, well, you get to finish, but the terms were never yours. Nanette Center's story is much more graphic and brutal, which is having to put her pets to sleep because they can't make the move with her, and having to leave her aging mother behind, and not being able to be there when, potentially when her grandchild. I mean, these things, that's a human life. That's one human life out of hundreds of and thousands repeated over and over that needs to be told, and it doesn't get told in those numbers.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think, especially with centers, because so very often, when you're talking about working class issues, you're talking about working class communities, people from other places tend to say, well, why don't they just pick up and leave? Right. And I
Right.
think, centers that message, that really heartbreaking message, gives you a really clear picture of why people don't just get up and leave, right? So talk a little bit maybe about the social fabric of the different communities that you visited, and how in some ways maybe that counters some of the stereotypes about Ohio, about the Midwest, and about working class people more broadly.
Yeah, when I was a newspaper journalist, one of the themes that I wrote about consistently was the phenomenon of brain drain, of especially younger people with potential leaving Ohio and places like Ohio for places that offered seemingly better opportunity. And I was very aware of, in my hometown of Akron, that in my lifetime, Akron had lost 1/3 of its population, as many cities in industrial places have done. And so that was the narrative. And as I have moved into writing more essays and books about that topic, I've kind of turned that number around and recognized that 2/3 of the people are still here, essentially. And one of the things that was reinforced for me as I traveled around Ohio is that people who've stayed in Ohio generally are here for a reason. They're here for a commitment that's not the easy commitment to make, or the easy, life choice to make. It's probably easier for many people to leave Ohio and go to a city with a lot more job opportunity, or better weather, or a better pro football team, conditions that might seem to be an easier life, or a better life to live. And so there's a kind of pride here that's kind of that sort of like tough pride of sticking it out through hard times. That's true. That's authentic and true. And but also a recognition that, when you take away something like the Lordstown plant, there isn't another job like that for somebody like Monty Woolley or Nanette Centers. And also something that's kind of under the surface is the people who had those jobs in that community that's been really toughing it out for so long kind of resented the people who had the jobs, because those were like, you have nothing to complain about, is kind of the message. And so they're also dealing with, like, they're not being felt as sorry for as some others will be. So when the president is taunting these people in tweets, as he did from time to time by way of attacking the union president, it's like, you all pull yourselves up by the bootstraps, kind of was his message. There aren't bootstraps there. And, and so it's there's a lot that the people who live in these places understand about the lives they live and the sacrifices they have to make to live them, and the dangers when certain things get taken away that aren't understood unless we're telling our own narrative. And that's important. I'll tell you a real quick story that kind of goes to my hometown. A few weeks ago, when Donald Trump learned that Goodyear was not allowing people to wear political slogans on their clothing, and one example was a MAGA cap, and he tweeted out, "Don't buy Goodyear tires because they don't, let people wear my hats in the workplace." The resonance of that here in Akron was, you unless you understand a place like this, you can't even believe how up in arms people were. Because if you damage Goodyear, if you take Goodyear away, we can't get that back. There isn't something else that fills that really important void of a world headquarters of a major corporation. We don't have two more of those to fill in the void. And so when he did that, and their stock price dropped for a short time because he has that power, doesn't recognize the effect. And this isn't him. It's most people don't recognize how much we have to work to maintain just what we have.
Yeah. That's a really it's an excellent example and a fascinating point. And one of the things that you talk about in the book, and that you say you're setting out to do, right, is to show the ways in which Ohio is like America. It's that bellwether, for all of the reasons that many of us know. And I guess I'm wondering, as you dug into these stories, as you listen to people, does Ohio reveal to some degree a myth of America that is somehow different from what we thought it was?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, first of all, the reason Ohio is such a reliable bellwether, especially a political bellwether, but I think in a spiritual bellwether, is because there's a quantifiable pattern of distinct regional differences here that doesn't exist in another state. And it's scientists, it's referred to as the 5 Ohios. And we have 5 distinct regions that each represent culturally and politically and in voting patterns and other patterns, each represents a different part of America. And so you take them in aggregate, and it's not like they form this consistent soup. It's like they maintain their differences. It's more like a TV dinner from the 1960s with different departments. That's the worst metaphor ever. I should not have said that to an Englishman.
I love
But
that.
it's not soup, it's a TV dinner. Ohio. But one of the things I was trying, all through this, I was like, what is the one thing that's like the true Ohio? And you can't really say one thing, but I think in each of those different kinds of regions, there's the small town, and there's rural small town, and there's the suburban small town, and there's the Appalachian small town, and there's the you know, and so forth, and there's the industrial small town. And so the myth of America that I really felt was when I went to the small town of Mansfield.
Hmm.
Mansfield is this struggling place. It's been, you know, it's been hit by the Rust Belt forces as hard as any place in Ohio has been. And it's a place that would be easy to give up on. And the people who have not given up on it, one of the things that they did is, in order to try to spur new activity downtown, they raised money, private money, and they built a little park with a carousel in it, right in the middle of downtown Mansfield. It's the most quaint, small town, charming. You can't be cynical about it. It's just, you hear that music, the calliope music, and you see the horses going up and down. And it doesn't matter what else is happening in Mansfield. It feels like a myth of America that we want to believe in. And so as I was exploring Mansfield, I went to visit the little bookshop that was downtown called Main Street Books. And I talked to Leyland Fowler, and she is a young woman who left in her 20s, and she went and lived in New York City and in Washington, D.C. and in Boston, you know, all of the patterns of brain drain. And then as she was about to turn 30, she decided she wanted to come back to her hometown. She returned. So right there is a story of hope. And she returned, and she started managing this little bookshop that was owned by somebody who's bought up some of the properties in this beleaguered downtown. And when she leaves for work in the morning from her apartment in downtown Mansfield, and she walks down Main Street to the bookstore, she said it feels like Sesame Street. The other shopkeepers are out there, like Mr. Hooper's out there sweeping his doorstep, and they're all like, hey, Leyland, hey, Leyland. She said it just feels like this myth of America that we want to believe still exists. And she comes to the bookshop where she's never made any money. You know, she's definitely doing this the hard way, but she's trying to stay true to an ideal. And she said, people want to believe that this is what America really is, but you have to sacrifice and make hard decisions, and sometimes make uncomfortable decisions, and sometimes spend a little bit more than you would spend buying something on Amazon to maintain that ideal that we want to believe. And that story stayed with me, and I've been talking in interviews and in events like this since for the past like month and a half or so. And I've been telling that story over and over again, and in a way like hearing the voice of hope in my own voice. Well, 2 weeks ago, I got an email from Leyland saying the bookstore is not going to make it. We're closing at the end of the month. To me, that is the warning.
Mm-hmm.
That's, if that American ideal, if that myth of America is that much endangered, that ought to be a warning that we ought to be listening to.
Yeah. So that's huge. And let's follow that somewhat dark path for a minute, because it reminds me of your fairly lengthy discussion in the book about malls becoming Amazon distribution centers, right?
Yeah.
And that seems to me a relevant thread to this idea, because when we think of the mall, certainly, you know, it was a retail, it was a business enterprise, but it was also based on a kind of communal space, right? On gathering.
Right.
And Amazon feels very different, right? You drive
Yeah.
by an Amazon facility, you're not allowed in there. So
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that transition and why it is it's such an important part of your book in terms of thinking about Ohio now and Ohio in the future, and by proxy, America.
Yeah, there's this fascinating sort of trend of Americans' consumer habits that begins with the downtown department stores, the ones that we see depicted in A Christmas Story when when Ralphie is looking at the beauty window. You know, that was the quintessential American retail and social and cultural experience of shopping. And it's remembered nostalgically. And at first, the suburban shopping mall was resented for like sort of being seen as the thing that killed that model of Americanism. And the shopping mall in the suburbs became this nostalgic, warm thing where we didn't just go to buy things, but we socialized. And it's where high schoolers met, you know, like their boyfriends and girlfriends on the sly, and you bought Orange Julius, and you know, these experiences that took place in the mall. This very based completely on commercial retail economy, but also became this part of our social fabric. And so then as those are dying, and Amazon is being blamed as part of the cause of their death, and then the dead mall is becoming this symbol of American, a part of an American collapse. Suddenly Amazon is going to those spaces, which are located ideally for their distribution centers, usually near large population centers, usually near major transportation routes. They work really well, and they saw this opportunity. And they're reclaiming them as these giant warehouses, and where we then order on here, don't even have to leave the house, and a product arrives on our doorstep. It's a closing off of the social aspect, but it's another one of those things. It's complex because most of those dying malls are in communities where there's been massive job loss. I mean, a mall dies in part because the economy is in trouble. And so Amazon, whatever somebody might think about Amazon as a force in American life, is giving new good paying jobs to people in communities that need them desperately. And you know, these are not easy questions, but to that idea of how is this a part of American life, the difference is that in that third beat of that trend, where we went from meeting and socializing in public downtown, and then we met and socialized and did things out in public in the suburbs. Now the equation is that there's no meeting or socializing or anything that has to do with that part of our commercial existence, our retail existence. Like I said, we do it, like I probably could, starting right now without anything except my credit card number, I could probably not leave this chair for a month and not only survive, but probably be like super comfortable. Like stuff like, you know, like back massagers and like exotic foods. As long as I had someone to go to the doorstep and bring it to me, I could do everything else.
So David, I actually thank you for pointing out, first of all, you know, that the mall was seen, you know, the demise of the downtown, right? That was an important part of that trajectory that I left out of that question. So that just generates some further questions, because on one hand, we have, in the example of the bookstore and in the craft breweries that you devote a good bit of time to that in the book as well, a kind of yearning, or even a, you know, I'll use the nostalgia term, which so often permeates, you know, discussions about working class Ohio and communities and stuff. So on one hand, we have that kind of nostalgia, and it's a very real pull for a kind of community.
Right.
I guess I'm wondering, does nostalgia then, in your conversations, in your view of what's happening in Ohio now, does nostalgia contain potential for a kind of regeneration in the same way that it contains a kind of potential for exploitation?
Yeah, well, I'll sort of, I'm going to give you a two-headed answer, because in
You had a question.
that chapter about the demise of American malls, I invoke Scott Russell Sanders, the essayist, who wrote an essay about returning to his Ohio home and finding that not only is it gone, but it's been replaced by a man-made reservoir. It's literally underwater. And he refers to nostalgia, and he takes it back to its Greek roots, where the translation becomes return pain. Because we think of nostalgia as a warm, kind of almost sappy feeling, but he says, its actual root is return pain, which means when you go back to the memories, you're also going back to your old pain. And so, so I think that's important, because I think it's important to see, like, we can't just remember things that were taking place in the past as like, that's what we want to get back to, like that kind of like sort of reactionary conservatism that also takes us back to times when we were more racist and more segregated, more sexist, and more polluted, and all of these other things. But I also quote the great urban visionary Jane Jacobs in this book, who says, new ideas need old buildings.
Yes.
So her idea, and this idea of progress that you're implying, that we can move forward by way of nostalgia, and it's so important in places like Youngstown and Akron, because we have plenty of old buildings, and we have plenty of symbols of our previous success. And if we just tear those down and move forward, we're not moving forward on any kind of an upward plateau. We're just moving forward with blindly. If you build on those things, if you go into an old building and you do something new, you're building on a spiritual energy that's truly important. And I think even I could probably even quantify it economically, that it's going to imply something better about the spirit of a community that had thrived once, and it again. I think there's a reason that craft brewers so often go into old, brick spaces where there were factories or warehouses or whatever they were previously, because there's a spirit of gathering for a drink that's like it's a celebration, that we've come from somewhere, and we've been through some hard times, and here we are, raising a glass together, still surviving. That's an Ohio spirit. And if you just walk into a bland, vanilla, brand new drywalled room and you raise that same glass, you don't have that same spirit, of that energy, because I really do think there's psychic energy in public spaces, and you don't achieve it there. I mean, the brewery that I wrote about is in Mansfield. It's in an old mortuary. If there's not psychic energy in the walls of an old mortuary, I give up. So.
Well, and that's also about making as well, isn't it? I mean, when you're talking about the craft brewery,
Yeah.
and you really do use it as a kind of an example, right? So that's also about a kind of artisan craftsmanship, go a different kind of nostalgia, right? For a kind of work and a kind of making of things that
Right.
was once such a part of Ohio.
Yeah. I mean, the word craft is in the term, and that's yeah. I mean, if there's one, I think if there's another consistency across Ohio, it's in this notion of craft, of making things. Even in the places that aren't manufacturing, I think they all carry that same kind of sensibility and pride in that we make things. And so the thing I like about the craft brewing trend, in addition to the fact that I just love beer, is
I thought that was it, actually.
it's one of these things. So it's one of these things that looks like it's a superficial thing that's just like what hipsters do or yuppies do, but inevitably, or maybe not inevitably, but generally, when a craft brewer goes into a blighted neighborhood or a blighted downtown, it's a symbol that that place is coming back. It's an economic driver, but it's also like a sign that there's new economic life. People are going there now as a destination. And so these, unlike a bookshop, which probably does kind of have to be subsidized by a landlord who sees its value beyond just his bottom line, craft brewers are making money. I mean, they themselves are being profitable, but they're also helping neighborhoods to start to prosper again.
Yeah, it's a really interesting example, and I could see why it's important, to the larger fabric of the book. It reminds me of, discussions of progressive nostalgia, right? Where nostalgia can be a way of reimagining social and even political relationships, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to do a really hokey segue that's something of a pun and ask you about your craft. And I want to go back to a really wonderful line in the passage that you began this conversation with. So if I can, this is page 43, and it's when you're talking about Springsteen. The line between fetishization and sincere illumination was dangerously thin. Well, that seems to me to take on a new meaning when you're writing about your own community, your own home, right? So, talk about as a writer how you navigate that line, how you achieve sincere illumination.
That's a great question. Um, well, first of all, no, I don't think anybody fetishizes Ohio. So it's a pretty safe, like nobody else is like trying to be Ohio to be cool. So I think we're okay there, but I know what you mean. Like I wrote, people in Ohio where we've been burnt, we've been down, and we've had to work hard to get back. They can read bullshit easily. And I know as a native that I'm just sort of like fronting certain concepts or taking on certain struggles as my own to sort of give myself an authenticity. I know people will hear it, and I've heard it. I've heard other people do it, and so I guess I'm just sort of like sort of preternaturally cautious about it because I'd been around long enough that I could just kind of hear that BS creep in. And I also know that because we've earned it so hard that I wouldn't want to take it on, and I certainly wouldn't want to say, like like I'm the savior or something. I need to, like project how great we are. I'm that's why I liked this project because I felt much more like I was just either channeling other people's voices and stories or being sincerely informed by them. So any statement that I made on my own had been either given to me or tested by my experiences with like real Ohioans. So yeah, I mean, um, sincerity is important. Yeah, like I think it's more important now. Like we went through the age of irony in the '90s, and it was fun. I like the writers in that age of irony. I probably learned too much from them. But I feel like we're in a lot of ways, especially in nonfiction, that we're in an age of sincerity where it's not key to be sincere because I think we need to understand some truths right now when so much again, like so many, there needs to be a voice that everybody on every side is hearing and believing, because right now the voices are so divided and so separated that we're only hearing the voices of our choices. And I don't know who or what that voice is going to be, but I think we need it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, thank you for that answer. I love that answer. And as a way of, I guess, winding down our conversation, I'm wondering, in that answer, you were talking about different truths that emerge when you're letting people tell their own stories. And you know, I I'm gonna I'm gonna end this with a confession, David. I'm not an Ohioan. I've been here for 17 years, but I've been here long enough that I defend this place, right? Um, and I think I've got a pretty good bullshit detector as well. And this book feels sincere. Can you tell me maybe one or two things that emerge as truths, as the things that need to be heard? You start the book saying Ohioans want to be heard. You end the book saying Ohioans want to be heard, right? So, what are a couple of things that Ohioans are screaming for?
Um, Civility. This is something that I got over and over, that people are just exhausted by just the constant beating of angry voices and of division, and also even though I was very clear in my approach to people that I wanted them to speak for themselves, most people were not comfortable directly talking, not just about their politics, but about certain ideals in their lives that they should feel comfortable talking about. So that's one for sure. And I think the other truth that came through for me was I set out to test whether Ohio still it has a kind of authenticity that's an American authenticity that's useful to the nation. That if we look here, we can see something of ourselves broadly as an American culture that's useful. And I came away, and I've come, and in the months since I finished the book, and the pandemic has really tested a lot of American life, I do feel like we still have value, and it's in part, it's the value of looking at the overlooked place, of looking to the overlooked person, of listening to the underheard voice, and not allowing the noise and the fog to obscure that to the point where we don't see it or hear it anymore.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's an excellent way of capping our discussion here tonight. David Giffels, I want to thank you for reading, for sharing, and for talking about Barnstorming Ohio. I would like to thank Karen and all of the Lit Youngstown folks for inviting me to this festival. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you, Tim. Your questions were great. It's been so great to engage with people for the past 2 days across the festival. And thank you, Karen, for your grace and organizational skills. And
I know, she's amazing.
it's been a great experience. So then whoever's out there, thank you for watching, listening, and being part of the festival.
David, I feel like our conversation isn't over, because I feel like next time I teach working class literature, I'm going to be hitting you up for another discussion.
I'd love to come back to Youngstown. So yeah.
Thanks
All
so
right.
much.
Thank you, Tim.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.